significant and impactful, perhaps one of the most significant and impactful participants in the civil rights history in movement in the United States. And when you think of the places that she was at, the high water marks of the Montgomery bus boycott that was initiated by the Montgomery Improvement Association in 1955, the March on Washington for Freedom and Jobs in 1963, the Selma to Montgomery March. She was at all of those. Dr. King, of course, Ralph Abernathy, Andrew Young, and a bunch of others. Andrew Young wasn't even in Montgomery, but those three, Dr. King, Ralph Abernathy, as well as Rosa Parks, were at all three of those momentous occasions. So why don't we start off with a little biography, a little timeline of her life. She was born Rosa Macaulay, and she was the daughter of James Macaulay and Leona Macaulay. She was baptized in the AME church. She would attend the AME church on the third Sunday of each month, and then she would attend the Baptist church on the other Sundays. So she had an ecumenical background from the very beginning. When her parents separated, she moved with her mother and her brother Sylvester to Pine Level, Alabama, which is near Montgomery. She would grow up in her maternal grandparents' farm. She attended elementary school in Pine Level, and then she attended, and by the way, that was quite a thing to attend school and to graduate from high school ever, to get that education. She went to the Industrial School for Girls in Montgomery, began attending it in 1924. In 29, she left school to care for her grandmother, and she later stayed home to take care of her mother as well. She would marry Raymond Parks in 1932 on December the 15th, 1932. And in 34, at the age of 21, she would receive her high school diploma. A lot of people, and you don't have to raise your hands, but just kind of acknowledge and think about this. A lot of people think that Rosa Parks was a person who just kind of had enough, you know. They think of her as an older woman when she sat down in the bus in Montgomery and refused to give up her seat. They think of her as kind of doing it impulsively out of passion. And I want to highlight some things now that show that she was being prepared for this. She prepared herself and was part of a movement that eventuated in her sitting down in order to stand up for justice. In 1943, in December, she became the secretary of the Montgomery NAACP. She would try to register to vote in 1943, and she was denied twice, actually. She was forced off a bus for the first time for not entering at the back door. That was in 1943. That's 12 years before she's officially arrested for doing the same. She finally receives a certificate for voting in 1945. She becomes an advisor to the NAACP Youth Council there at Montgomery in 1949. In 1955, and we'll see a slide of this later on, she attends the Highlander Folk School in Monteagle, Tennessee. And this was a legendary, what became legendary, training grounds for, led by Miles Horton, and was fashioned after some things that were going on in Europe to train people to take action and to express power in the political realm and in the social realm. It would be Pete Seeger also who went to the Highlander School. Pete Seeger, who wrote that song that if you don't even know Pete Seeger's name, you know the song Turn, 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 that was based on the book of Ecclesiastes. This Highlander School is very prominent and also very infamous according to the racist white supremacist propaganda machine that was fomenting information about Dr. King and also Rosa Parks. It would be in 1955. It's very interesting. She lives in Montgomery. She's a member of the AME church there, St. Paul. She knows the school that's near there. The black middle class attends Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, which is where Dr. King goes in 54 as he's finishing up his PhD thesis and getting ready for it to be approved at Boston University School of Theology. But she doesn't meet him until she goes to the Highlander School in 1955. That's in the summer of 1955. Then on December the 1st, she's arrested for not yielding her seat to a white man on a Montgomery bus. She's arrested, though, as part of a pattern, or her refusal to get off the bus and to give up her seat was preceded by Claudette Colvin, who at the age of 15 had also been arrested because of her refusal to give up a seat to a white passenger. In October of 55, an 18-year-old, Mary Louise Smith, had been arrested under similar circumstances, but both cases failed to kind of stir Montgomery's Black leadership to help launch a mass protest. It was Rosa Parks that kind of was the straw that broke the camel's back. They had the perfect person, a person of relative middle-class means, very respectable, not quite 40, very presentable, if you will, and it was strategic. Dr. King talks about Rosa Parks' sterling character in Stride Toward Freedom, his book about the Montgomery Improvement Association's boycott of the buses. She stands trial on December the 5th, 4 days later, is found guilty. She attends a meeting, and I want to register this. I don't think I have this in the notes right here, but she attends a meeting at the Holt Street Baptist Church. And this is one of the most famous orations that King gives. And you can find portions of it on the internet. Holt Street Baptist Church. And it is Dr. King has been elected the president of the MIA, the Montgomery Improvement Association, probably not more than maybe 12 hours before. He has had almost no preparation to write a manuscript and for his speech. And his speech there is electrifying. And it shows you how the MIA chose rightly in picking him to be their president. He knows Rosa Parks slightly from the training at the Highlander School. He knows her now because of the NAACP and all that, and he will get to know her much, much better. But if you can find that speech, listen to it, and she is in the audience, and she's referenced in the speech throughout. Everybody knows that this is a catalytic moment in the history of Montgomery, and a few people, I think, know that it's a catalytic moment in the history of the United States, that things are about to change radically and drastically. She will lose her job, by the way. She's a seamstress at the Montgomery Fair department store, and she does adjustments, alterations, etc. And she will lose her job because of her fame now in the civil rights movement. She just loses it about a year later. Less than a month later. She's re-indicted for boycotting and given another case. And then finally, in November the 13th, 1956, segregation on the buses is declared unconstitutional. And on December the 21st, a little bit over a year after they had begun the boycott, boycotters, the people who protested, led by Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, they returned to going on the buses. In 57, she moves to Detroit. There was among a lot of people, and I think she had a little bit of this, that the feeling that the North was not quite as bad as the South. I've not been able to find that her life had been threatened any more than normal for any kind of leader in the civil rights movement that kind of spurred her to move there, except I think that there was the promise of maybe better employment, and also for her husband and herself, and also a better life. In 1963, she attends the Washington March on the Mall there, and she also speaks at the SCLC National Convention. She participates in the Selma to Montgomery March. She begins working for Congressman John Conyers in Detroit in 65. Her husband dies in 77. Her mother dies in 79. It should be noted, maybe you may or may not know this award, the Spingarn Medal is the highest accolade that the National NAACP can give, and they give it to her in 1979. She co-founds the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development with the help of her friend Elaine Steele there in Detroit. She retires from working for the congressman, and she has the same year in 88 a pacemaker put in. I'd like you to imagine the ravaging that was done to her body by virtue of the stresses, the strains, the angst, the pressure of what it meant for her to be a leader and also a catalyst for the civil rights movement. Let's move on to some accolades. She has one thing after another happen to her. In 91, a bust is unveiled at the Smithsonian. She publishes 2 books that are with some assistance of a ghostwriter. First, Rosa Parks' My Story, then Quiet Strength. She receives from Bill Clinton the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1996. And then from the Congress, she receives in 1999 the Congressional Gold Medal. The Rosa Parks Library and Museum, which is connected with Troy University in Montgomery, Alabama, opens on December 1st, coincidentally and appropriately, the year 2000. So that's, my goodness, 45 years after the fact of her initial action. She will die in Detroit, Michigan in 2005. And look at how she is honored. Her coffin is flown to Montgomery, where she lies in repose at the St. Paul AME Church. That's on the 29th of October. On the 31st, her casket is transported to Washington, D.C., where she lies in honor in the U.S. Capitol, with 50,000 folks viewing. And also a memorial service is held at the Metropolitan AME Church. And by the way, I suggest that you go there and put your hand at the pew where both Lincoln, as well as Sojourner Truth, as well as W.E.B. Du Bois sat. It is a famous church and great congregation. Then on November the 1st through the 2nd, she lies in repose at the Charles Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit. And then on the 2nd, she has a funeral at this mega church, the Greater Grace Temple Church. And the service lasts 7 hours with 4,000 people attending. She's interred next to her husband and mother in a mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in Detroit. And then February 27th in 2013, a statue of her is placed in the U.S. Capitol's National Statuary Hall. And we'll see some of that. We'll see that statue actually in just a moment. So these are pictures. Here she is in her infancy on the far left. Here's Raymond and her right after they get married. Here is this famous picture of her. You can see that they've highlighted Dr. King with that arrow pointing to him. 4 persons to his right, on our left, is Rosa Parks. And this is the Highlander School at Mount Eagle, Tennessee. This is part of her preparation. Remember, I said she was the secretary in 43. She became the youth leader in 45. She'll go to this Highlander School in 55. So from all of that, all of her, that's 12 years of preparation that she's had to lead up to the momentous occasion of her being arrested, which you see on the far right. I put in a picture of her mother, which is the second from the left in the middle row. And she loved her mom and she took care of her mom. She would also kind of cavort around with the hoi polloi and all the celebrities and luminaries of the civil rights movement. Shirley Chisholm in the middle, Stokely Carmichael on the right there. And then on the lower left, this is Joseph Lowry, who was the head of the SCLC, a Methodist pastor in Atlanta. And she's at a megaphone protesting apartheid there. All right. Then she's receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Clinton, from Vice President Gore, the Congressional Medal, gold medal. And this is Aretha Franklin singing at her funeral in Detroit with Jesse Jackson in the background as well. So you can see she has a celebrated luminary life of her own. There are some wonderful artifacts in the Library of Congress that shows her own testimony, if you will, about that momentous occasion in 55. She wrote, "I had been pushed around all my life and felt at this moment that I couldn't take it anymore. When I asked the policeman why we had to be pushed around, he said he didn't know. The law is the law. You are under arrest. I didn't resist." She had been trained in nonviolent resistance and passive resistance. She didn't resist. She didn't strike back. She was arrested, taken in, as you saw on that slide, she was fingerprinted. Now, all of this was to get gain for transportation so that there wouldn't be segregation on transportation. I'd like you to note the date for this poll tax receipt. This is 1957, January the 21st, 1957. After the 24th Amendment was established that gave everybody the right to vote, universal suffrage, except for women, that would have to wait until 1920. Black people could vote, but the way that, especially in the South, that law was gotten around and that constitutional amendment was gotten around was through the poll tax. And it looks like it's meager, $1.50. But to many people, that was unaffordable. They couldn't pay it, and therefore they could never gain access to the right to vote. How did white people get around that? Oh, if you had voted in the past, you didn't have to pay the poll tax. So Black folks were, from the very beginning, in the South at the very least, had one obstacle after another, after another, after another. Some of you have heard stories about in Georgia that to go vote, you had to pass a test. And one of the questions on the test was, how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap? How many soap bubbles are there in a bar of soap? Well, who can answer that idiotic question? That's meant to keep people oppressed and keep them from exercising their constitutional right to vote. This is 1957. This issue for poll tax doesn't get resolved until the 60s, by the way. Where do we start? Well, there are a lot of books. There are her two books on the far left, or the two books on the left, Rosa Parks' My Story and Quiet Strength. I love both of those. Then my Reflections by Rosa Parks is, it's a nice book. It is not a coffee table book, but it is not a scholarly book. The book on the far right by Douglas Brinkley is, I believe, the year 2000. and it's been also published in paperback, and it's a scholarly assessment, but it's mostly up to the time and a little bit after she moves to Detroit. And then, so from 1957 on, there's some mention of her work with Congressman Conyers, but not a whole lot. The book, in my opinion, that gives more fulsome, in the best sense of that word, fulsome, treatment of her life is The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, but it too still is very, very thin. In my opinion, there is no definitive, final scholarly work. There may be some dissertations out there that probably, they might be unreadable, meaning they might be boring, but they might be exhaustive of all of the literature, all of her papers. But I have not yet found it yet. These two books at the bottom are good. This is a children's book on the right lower, The Real Story of Rosa Parks for Kids. And there are tons of children's books for her, about her. And that's a good thing because it lifts her up as an exemplar and gives access to, especially Black kids, to show her life as one that could be emulated. This is the Rosa Parks Museum in Montgomery. It's connected with Troy University, and they have this statue that's on the inside there. They have a replica of the bus, but not the bus. The bus that Rosa Parks sat down in is in Memphis, Tennessee. There is this marker that has the old symbol for Alabama that's so Confederate related. And that is in the city. And I put this picture of the car that says Holt Street. Baptist churches, would to use an old word, they would serve as jitneys, right? That's what my grandmother said when I bought her car from her, and it was my first car, 1955 Plymouth. You could have a picnic in the back seat. It was so huge. And I love that car. And I became the jitney for the family to take my sisters to school, to Girl Scout meetings and the like, go to church. At any rate, the Holt Street Baptist Church had several vehicles, and this is one of them. It's been restored, and it had the Holt Street name on it, also on the side. That's how people got around the city in Montgomery. Remember, they boycotted for over a year. Not quite a year, 350 something days. They boycotted almost a year, and they got around by people getting into church vehicles and getting to work or getting to school or getting to the doctor. This is how she's remembered around the country. I'll go from the top left to the right. This is the bust of her in the Smithsonian that was established in 1951. The next slide is next picture is in the West End Dallas Area Transportation Association. They have this memorial to her. In downtown Memphis, they have erected her. I love it that she's standing up. I love that. She's standing up. I don't think it looks a whole lot like her, but that's hard to do in brass, of course. But Montgomery was very proud to do this statue in downtown Montgomery. Lower left-hand side is from the Smithsonian. It's almost like paper mache. It's very interesting with these looming police officers and little bitty Rosa Parks in the middle of them. The picture with the bus is from Memphis, Tennessee. I hope and trust that some of you will make it to the National Civil Rights Museum that's housed in the Lorraine Motel, which is where Dr. King was assassinated, on the balcony. It is a marvelous museum, and they have put the bus that Rosa Parks sat down in there. And they have these brass statues of women, probably domestic workers, that were refusing to get on the bus. This standing statue that has also the bus seat is from Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is also connected to Rosa Parks because of her living in Michigan. And then Statuary Hall 2013 is when in the Capitol, when this statue was officially included. There's a lot of audio-visual resources. I'm recommending 3, 1 on this page and 2 on the next. The Rosa Parks story is really wonderfully done with Angela Bassett. It's very dramatic. It pulls at your heartstrings. It pulls no punches. It wants to make an emotional impact. And it is, it's free on YouTube. I've provided you the YouTube link there. And if Brent provides the slide deck, you can use that to go to this. So you don't have to rent it. It's free. It's an hour and a half, not too bad. There are other movies and videos that you can get. The First Lady of the Civil Rights Movement, which is how Rosa Parks is regarded. Then there's this My Life with Rosie, which is also nice and sweet, about an hour long. But I really like these 2 that have been kind of gathered together in 2013. They're very brief about how Rosa Parks trained for a life of activism. That's only about 8 minutes and 16 seconds. That kind of backs up and supports what I was saying earlier. And then the Rosa Parks Papers, which is, do you remember the journalist Gwen Ifill on PBS? She narrates the Rosa Parks Papers Religion and Ethics News Weekly piece that's 7 minutes and 23 seconds. And it was done on PBS. This is a wonderful program that Bob Abernathy had, and you would do well to watch that as well. The Southern Poverty Law Center, that's also in Montgomery, by the way, part of their teaching tolerance they didn't win, but they got nominated for an Academy Award for a documentary called Mighty Times, The Legacy of Rosa Parks. It's very powerful, a little dated as far as I'm concerned. But I would recommend both of those PBS-related pieces. So what are the foundations of Rosa Parks' great soul? Well, she was part of a tradition. People don't really give enough credit here to women civil rights activists. I mean, it's amazing. Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Phyllis Wheatley, Ida B. Wells, Mary McLeod Bethune, Marian Anderson, and then also Claudette Colvin, I said, 15 years old, who 9 months before Rosa Parks' arrest was arrested also for the very same act in Montgomery. Their names are legion, the number of women activists who've done this. By the way, if you ask anybody to answer with honesty about what has maintained the Protestant church, and you probably could say Catholic too, in America, it would be women. Women have taken care of the church forever. Men get the credit, but the women have done the work. She also, secondly, I say, has a holy defiance. She defiantly refused to give up her seat because she was tired spiritually and existentially, not because she just kind of gave up the ghost. Well, I'm just not going to get off, but because she said she did not want to be continually humiliated over something I had no control over, the color of my skin. Now that is a holy defiance. She also had preparation and training. NAACP, the Highlander Folk School, years of devoted practice of her deep Christian faith. We'll get into that in just a moment. She was taken to church, as I said, the AME church on one Sunday a month and the Baptist church the other 3 Sundays. By the way, if you're a Baptist, my goodness, in the old days in the South, you had Sunday morning services, then you had Sunday evening service, then you had youth training, then you had Wednesday night service, and sometimes they would even have services on Friday night. So she was deeply steeped in the church. The next three of these 9 foundations, I think, she was given daily devotions. We don't do this much. We don't champion it. We don't highlight that practice. But in the old days, in her life, she did. There would be daily devotions, meaning there'd be scripture reading, and her grandfather would pray, not just for meals, but they would do this on a daily basis in a regular rhythm, a religious practice in the home. She also was the beneficiary of homespun wisdom, what we could call mother wit. And this is my favorite saying from her. She repeated this all the time. If you live life yard by yard, it sure is hard. But if you live it inch by inch, life's a cinch. And this is where small practices done in a rhythm regularly mount up over time. Mother Teresa was once asked, what are the great acts of love? And she said, there are no great acts of love. There are only small acts done with great love. And she learned this from her mother, Rosa Parks did, this sometimes hackneyed phrase, but something that really served her well. She also kind of what I call had a religious library. She had scriptures that she had memorized. And by the way, I would suggest this. I did it as a pastor. I do it to friends now. You ought to have a couple of scriptures that you can hang around in your back pocket. You might need them. So sometimes you might want to know, well, what's my purpose? Well, one of the things I keep in my back pocket is Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O humanity, what is required, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Well, that's not just piety being spewed out to impress anybody. That's so that you can know how you're to live. So she had great respect for the Psalms, and her favorite was Psalm 27, 1-7. And her favorite hymns were Woke Up This Morning with My Mind Stayed on Freedom. I'm on Jesus, by the way. I'm bound for the promised land. Oh, freedom over me. And these were kind of her soundtrack, if you will, in her soul that marked her days. She had this church community, and I think everybody knows how a church community can be a refuge, a haven, and a source for information and inspiration. But this is really true in the Black church. I mean, the church community is the source of power, support, foundation. When everything else gives up on you, when all other institutions are closed to you, the church, especially in Rosa Parks' life, was there. It was welcoming, enfolding her. And it was a refuge, a haven, and a consistent, enduring source of information and inspiration. Also, she had a moment of confirmation of what she was doing. And this happened in the pews at St. Paul Episcopal Church, AME Church, rather, where she experienced a true peace of mind sweeping over her as a blessing from God. Not unlike what Dr. King had when his house had been bombed and he was constantly being threatened. And you may know it's called the midnight hour in the kitchen moment, where Dr. King was communing with the Almighty, and the Almighty spoke back to Dr. King and said, Martin Luther King, stand up. I'm with you. And he felt resolution. Well, she had something similar. She had this in her church where even because of the stress and strains of all that she had been through, she still felt this true peace of mind. But I want to also highlight one sterling aspect of her character. She lived a life of gratitude. She had a posture of gratitude. She was always grateful for each new day. And that's what makes folks erect statues of her all across the country, from Eugene, Oregon, to New Jersey, to Georgia Tech, to all of those other famous places I've shared with you already. So this requires a little bit of a setup. This is about 7, maybe 5 minutes long. We're about to hear the closing so-called prayer by, I don't normally like when people preach in the middle of a prayer. Have you ever heard prayers like that? Where you get preached at? I kind of like that intimacy prayer. But Charles Gilchrist Adams, he's misidentified in this clip, by the way, that he's part of a Baptist church there in Detroit. He's in Pilgrim Rest Missionary Baptist Church. That wasn't his church. There's a Charles A. Adams, and the people didn't know who they were talking about. Charles Adams is known as the Harvard Whooper. Whooping is a practice in Black preaching that's melodic, it's musical, it's dramatic, it's very effective. And he was asked to give the benediction at this service. So Jesse Jackson's there. You'll see Ed Bailey is in the audience. And this funeral is going on. And at the moment of 7:26 on to the end, you'll hear Charles Gilchrist Adams praying a prayer of thanks. He's misidentified. He's not Pilgrim Rest Missionary Baptist Church pastor. He was the pastor of the Hartford Memorial Baptist Church in Detroit, from Detroit. He is famous. He taught preaching at Harvard. We had him as the Martin Luther King Interfaith Service speaker a few years back. And this is one of his very famous tropes, if you will, at the very end, where he talks about saying thank you.
Let us pray to the Lord our God. O Lord our God, as we worship here in the beauty of holiness, we praise your name for the pastor and the people who prayed and gave and sacrificed and worked, that thousands of us might gather here today. Lord God, our dwelling place in all generations, we praise you for the victory of Christ that is made manifest to all in the quiet defiance of Rosa Parks. In her smiling life, we see your gracious face. We feel your amazing love. In her humble name, we hear the echoing vibrations of your excellent name and nature. As her name represents the powers of the weak, your name communicates the humanity and humility of ultimate power. O Lord our God, how excellent is your name. How awesome is your glory. How rich is your mercy. How inclusive is your peace. We cannot think about Rosa Parks without praising your name for making her who she is. As Archimedes called for a place to stand and a lever, and said he would move the earth, we praise you because she found a seat to sit on. And she stayed in that seat, and with your word and your living Christ, she moved the entire universe closer to justice, love, and peace. We praise you today because you gave her all she needed just to keep her seat. You made her keep her seat on row 11, behind 10 rows reserved only for whites. She sat on the aisle seat. Next to her sat a man nearest the window on the right-hand side of the bus facing forward. Next to her, there were 2 black men sitting in their seats. But oh God, it was you, nobody but you. The black men got up and moved when told to do so. A black woman got up and moved, but Rosa Parks kept her seat. We thank you that she sat in that seat because you told her to stay there. You told her that she was your child. and she didn't have to move back. You told her to keep her seat because she was made in your image, saved by your blood, designed for your glory, destined for your kingdom. She sat there so that we might sit in higher seats. And because she sat where she sat, we are now sitting in the halls of Congress, sitting on the Supreme Court, sitting as presidents and CEOs of global corporations, heads of Ivy League schools, pastors of mega churches, secretaries of state, sitting at the table where cosmic decisions are made. We thank you. We praise you because she sat where she sat. We praise you for the immovable power of a child of yours who knew that she was right and would not move. Custom said, get up. Society said, get up. History said, get up. The law said, get up. Uncle Tom Politics said, get up. The bus driver growled, get up. The policeman and the sheriff said, get up. But she sat there because you gave her the power to defy an unjust law. She heard your voice as recorded in Isaiah the 41th chapter and the 10th verse. She heard you say, fear not, for I am with you. I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. Yea, I will uphold you with the right hand of my righteousness. We praise you today because she took away all of the strength of Jim Crow. Jim Crow had to cough up blood. Absurdity had to move out of the way. We thank you that a meeting was called. A new leader was chosen. His name was Martin Luther King Jr. We thank you that because she sat down, you made her the midwife in the birth of the greatest leader for justice that the world has known since Christ. We thank you, Lord. Thank you. Because the oppressed souls have been set free. She sat there, and because she sat there, we're sitting up in here. Oh God, we must confess to you with utter honesty that we have not finished her defiant revolution. She cannot rest, oh God, until we renew our courage and do our work. We cannot rest. She cannot be at peace until the world comes closer to your will. There's too much greed, selfishness in the world. Oil companies are making windfall profits while poor people cannot afford to heat their homes or to put gas in their tanks. A few people have fabulous health care, but most people have no health care at all. 27 million Africans are dying with AIDS. She cannot rest until they've been treated. We have less than 20% of the earth's population, and yet we eat 80% of the earth's food. She cannot rest until somebody stands in the way of terrible injustice. Unnecessary and unwarranted wars are being fought, causing a monstrous waste of blood and money. Somebody needs to sit in the way. A proposal that will destroy affirmative action in Michigan will show up on the ballot in November 9, 2006. We need somebody to work to defeat that proposal. Oh God, you have taken her from us. We will miss the warmth of her deathless smile. We will miss the touch of her vanished hand. But do, Lord, put her mantle of courage on our shoulders. Straighten up our spines. Raise up our bowed down heads. Stir up our demoralized spirits. Help us to sit in the way of customs. Help us to sit in the way of injustice. Help us to march in the way of war and poverty until justice wells up as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Holy Spirit, for the purity of her heart. Thank you for the integrity of her personality. Thank you for the smile on her face, for the sanctity of her soul. Thank you for her gift of intelligence, for her faith and for her hope. Thank you that she did not die in mystery or perplexity, but she died in victory and certainty. Thank you that if we wear the image of the earthly, we should also put on the garments of eternity. Thank you that those who suffer here will reign beyond here. Thank you that when this earthly house has been dissolved, we got another building, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Thank you that the trumpet shall sound and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall all be changed. Thank you that death shall be swallowed up in victory, and we will see her face again. Thank you that we'll see Jesus. We'll be there when they crown him Lord of Lords. I wish I had 10,000 tongues just to thank you. If I were Chinese, I'd say Odia. If I were Danish, I'd say Mangatat. If I were Italian, I'd say Grazia. If I were Hebrew, I'd say Toda Rabba. If I were Greek, I would say Eucharisto. If I were Japanese, I'd say Domo Arigato. If I were Portuguese, I'd say Obrigado. If I were Spanish, I'd say Muchas Gracias. If I were German, I'd say Danke schön. If I were French, I'd say Merci beaucoup. If I were Russian, I'd say Spasiba. If I were Kenyan, I'd say Ashanta. If I were Nigerian, I'd say Eje Pupu. If I were Zulu, I'd say Ingia Bonga. If I were Sutu, I'd say Keyali Boha. If I were deaf, I'd say, but since I am who I am, and I got what I got, and I feel what I feel, I'll just say thank you, praise your name, amen.
We can all go home now, I think. Excuse me.
What'd you say, Susan?
I said we can all go home now, you know.
Exactly. That's why I put it at the end.
The life she lived, I guess. Yeah.
You don't follow that with anything. And by the way, the people who put that service together, they would never put anybody before after Charles Adams. He would get the last word because he is that great of a preacher. By the way, a lot of people would say, or some people might understand, oh, he just does that off the top of his head. He is a manuscript bound preacher. When he preaches, you can see him turn the pages over as he's preaching, and he reads his sermon, but he reads it magnificently with power and passion and effect. And he, except that thank you bit at the end, he's got that memorized. He's done that more than a few times.
That's awesome.
So I thought it would bring a little bit of her life and her the very thing that, you know, the last aspect of her journey there at that service. That's the last thing, and then she was buried. But it took him 5 days to pay honor to her all across the country, from Montgomery to Detroit and back to DC, then back to Detroit. So that's how great of a soul she is.
Hey, Bob, I found the Holt Street speech. You want me to play a little bit of it, or?
Yeah. How long is it?
Oh, it's about, I got like a 9-minute version. I mean, we
Oh,
can
yeah,
start-
play all of it. It's
Okay.
fantastic.
Okay, hang on a second, everybody.
And by the way, I regard this as one of the 2 greatest speeches he ever gave. There's another portion that says, history will record that once there lived a people with fleecy locks, and it's a Philip Dunbar poem that he's quoting from. King apparently had a photographic memory, even though he had no prepared text. There's not one manuscript of this. He had no time. He had been elected, I think, 12 hours before or less, the president of the MIA, the Montgomery Improvement Association, that would lead and go forward with the boycott. And he spoke like that night. So it's, I can't remember when I first discovered it. I think I was in divinity school, and I could not believe what I heard. I heard a recording of this, and then a transcript of it, of somebody that had printed it out. Any rate, and you could see the great tribute that he pays to Rosa Parks.
That is such a strong speech.
Yeah.
That gets right to your heart,
Yep.
your gut.
And people just need to hear that. They need to hear that. You know, there's some lesson in there that got left behind. I don't know.
There's
folks.
Paul Winfield, the actor, I think that's his name.
Yes.
He did a 3-part King mini television series, and they do the full speech, that whole part in that moment of King's life. So.